Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the public launch meeting of the NextG Alliance Integrated Sensing Communications Data Initiative. My name is JD Griffith. I'm the Managing Director of the ATIS NextG Alliance. And we just wanted to provide this overview as we get this initiative launched to let everyone in the community who are interested in integrated sensing communications know about the work we're looking to undertake in this initiative, know what exact goals we're trying to and gaps we're trying to address, and learn how to get more involved as we move forward, and also provide an opportunity to ask any questions you may have. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box in the Teams webinar application to answer any questions, and we will address those at the end. Real quick, we'll go through the agenda. We'll go through the background about the ecosystem, why this data initiative matters now, the gaps we're looking to address, some of the operational use cases we're targeting, as well as what we'll be looking at in more detail. We will then provide overview of the structure of the data initiative and exactly how we're outlining participation and leadership within NGA. And then we'll get into the work plan that we look to address over the next 12 months or so. And then I'll provide a quick overview of some of the parallel policy impacts we'll be investigating and discuss next steps. And with that, I will hand over to one of the co-chairs, Brian Daly, to provide information on the background of this initiative.
Great,
Brian?
thanks. Thank you, JD. So ISAC is a very exciting new capability that initially was 6G, and we're also looking at it as 5G advanced. So when we look at ISAC and the entire end-to-end system, we have a lot of focus being done right now in 3GPP and elsewhere to do the left-hand side of this figure, what I'll call the detecting and tracking. Is something there? Where is it? The sensing signals and the technology that's required in order to do the sensing from a 3GPP system. There is also work done, taking that sensing data and doing the processing of it to classify and identify it, what kind of thing it is and what specific thing it is, and provide those sensing results into a 5G wireless sensing service that exists within the 3GPP system. However, when you look at ISAC itself and all the many of the use cases for ISAC, the data itself and the sensing data is not going to be used by the mobile network operator or the 3GPP system. It's actually going to be handed off to some trusted third party that is actually going to be the consumer of that data and actually use that data and take whatever action they want. Outside ISAC, outside the mobile network or 3GPP operator system, they need to identify, more than what's been done within the 3GPP network. Is it a friend or a foe? What decisions am I going to take as a result of this? What engagement do I have to take? What's the threat or intent determination of what we've sensed? Do I trust the information, and what sort of enforcement functions do I take? And some of those actions outside of ISAC may also include non-ISAC data that needs to be incorporated into that decision process, including the results from the sensing service. ISAC ends with sensing-derived information. The detections, tracks, classifications, and possible identification inputs are all going to be used by a trusted third party. So why does this work matter now? A lot of the work, as I mentioned, is focusing on the waveforms, algorithm, performance metrics, the RF side of the network. The operational systems, those third-party consumers, really may not be able to consume the raw sensing outputs. ISAC informs, the other systems are going to decide and act on the ISAC data. And without a standardization, each deployment or use case may require its own data consumption requirements and have a unique interface. And if we're looking at, 30 some odd use cases, that potentially could be 30 different data consumption requirements, 30 different unique interfaces. And that will drive up the integration cost and also make multi-vendor ecosystems challenging, especially when we talk in more of this scale. So the NextG Alliance is uniquely positioned to address that last mile gap, as we call it, between the sensing networks or the 3GPP network and the sensing consumers. And on the right-hand side, I bring up a specific example of what happens if we don't do this right. There was a radar that was installed by the Arizona Department of Transportation on Interstate 10 between Phoenix and Tucson, which, if you're familiar with that area, during the summer monsoon seasons, they get a lot of dust storms. And there's been a lot of accidents on that particular stretch of the interstate because of the low visibility. Well, the problem is the Doppler radar in Phoenix and Tucson areas don't have good visibility down to ground level for that area. So the Department of Transportation decided to deploy a Doppler radar along the freeway in order to try to sense when a dust storm was detected, and that way it could warn the drivers. However, what they didn't think of was how to get the data from that Doppler radar into the National Weather Service, who issued the alerts. So essentially what you had is a Doppler radar that was sitting there idle, unable to provide its sensing information to the actual consumer of that data who would actually take action on it. We don't want ISAC to be that Doppler radar system. We need ISAC to be a system that's actually the data is going to be consumed and actually be usable to the end user. So what the gap is being addressed, again, what's defined today is the detection and tracking algorithms and the sensing performance validation. What's missing are standard ISAC data products, common schemas, semantics, confidence, and provenance, standard interfaces and transport models, and also security, governance, and interoperability rules. When we pass ISAC data off, we have to make sure it's passed off to a trusted third party, and there is also security mechanisms in place for securing that data and maintaining, the authentication of that data. Non-cellular based sensing systems don't have to expose data because they have all the processing within the closed system. We don't have a completely closed system. We have to be able to hand this data off to those third party, and this project fills that gap. Some of the target operational use cases, as I mentioned, if you look at 3GPP, there's, 30 some odd use cases defined for ISAC, but the initial focus would be really looking at some of the high impact domains such as homeland defense and counter UAS, FAA aerospace awareness and deconfliction, public safety and critical infrastructure, transportation traffic management, environmental monitoring, NOAA, National Weather Service, and venue and smart campus operations. However, we want to structure this so that the outputs are extensible beyond these initial use cases. So what will be investigated? The ISAC data product catalog, the data models and schemas, including coordinates, time, uncertainty, confidence, provenance, subscriptions, filtering, and geofencing. A reference delivery architecture, how are you going to expose the data, whether it be from the RAN or exposure from core sensing functions, as well as the security and governance, authentication, authorization, the integrity, auditability, and policy enforcement of the data. So let me now turn it over and we'll back to JD and we'll talk about the structure of the group.
Thanks, Brian. And with that, I'll hand it over to Havish Kurapati, our co-chair, who will go through the charter and participation and leadership for this initiative.
Thanks, JD. So hope you all can hear me well. So the charter of this group, I think Brian already kind of gave a very nice overview of what all this is about, but very succinctly, the mission is basically described here on the left. We need to identify end user requirements, and the sensing data is essentially sourced from mobile networks. But the idea then is to develop a framework for this sensing data and deal with its acquisition, representation, transport, delivery, security, governance, etc. So that is the mission. And the goals that it breaks down into is, of course, we need to identify the end user specific technical requirements. The use case driven approach that Brian was talking about, this is very key to that. And then understand the requirement profiles. And the most important part here is that while we have many different use cases and consumers of the products, try to have a common catalog of what these data products will be. So get some kind of consolidation of all of these requirements. And then based on that, we can then look at data models, reference architectures and delivery paths, and finally, what kind of interoperability requirements will be needed. So to compile all of this is essentially the charter of the group. If we go to the next slide. Yeah. And in terms of participation and leadership, what has been decided by ATIS is that companies must be an NGA or an existing ATIS member to participate. Non-ATIS or NGA member government agencies may be allowed to participate on a case-by-case basis, especially if they're quite important to the to understand the requirements and the output of this effort. Another criteria here is that all participants must not be barred from federal contracts. And in the interim, the steering group of the Next G Alliance, the co-chairs of the steering group are acting as the co-chairs of this effort. So I think that's all we have about the structure, and I'll hand it back over to JD.
Great. Thanks, Havish. And now we will go to co-chair Doug Castor, who will go a little bit into our approach and our initial work plan for this initiative.
Okay, thank you, JD. Hello, everyone. I'm Doug Castor, one of the other co-chairs. And for the work plan and the approach, as we discussed, this is a very consumer or customer-focused initiatives. And, a lot of times we see technology pushes, and here we're really trying to understand the technology pull. What is it that the customers and the consumers need, right? So we will be taking an approach like you see on the screen here, where we'll identify what the consumer actually needs and how they need it delivered. And we want to be careful we don't cast the net too wide with looking at these use cases as well. So we'll likely focus on an initial set of use cases that were shown in the prior slide. And then we'll move on to finding, the common needs. And, from that, we kind of collapse this into a set of manageable requirements, followed by looking at an architecture. How do we translate those needs and those requirements into data and interfaces on the architecture? Look at how the ISAC sensing data should be structured, exchanged, and secured as well. And then finally, as an outcome, we're looking to identify what is that standardization path, whether it's 3GPP, IATF, ORAN, and perhaps some others as well. Next slide. So a little bit more detail on the work plan. As I mentioned, we'll start out with the use cases in the first 2 to 3 months and have a very customer-driven approach where we intend to gather input from these government stakeholders and the consumer interests as well, followed by looking at the data requirements over a 3 to 6 month effort, looking at the data elements, the fidelity, the latency, update frequency, always on demand requirements. We'll identify the data formats and look at some existing standards. One of the suggestions that has come up is looking at the NATO data standards. So I think that's from some of the customers that are on the list, there's some interest in leveraging those standards. So we'll take a look at that. Synthesizing these use cases into consolidated data requirements, and then looking at the security and confidentiality and the AAA areas as well. And finally, next 3 to 6 months, looking at the data interface architecture, where we'll look at the models and the schema, the data flow, the topology, the life cycle and storage of the data, and likely KPIs as well. And then finally translating those into the standardization needs. Okay, thank you. JD, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Doug. All right. So one thing that, as we've kind of discussed and scoped out this program that came up several times regarding integrated sensing communications, was some of the policy impacts look like. So we're going to be taking a look at the policy and regulatory considerations involving both the government use and non-government or commercial use of ISAC sensing information, particularly as it involves security and privacy. You know, when we look at like potential federal customers, how do we need to protect certain data? What FISMA requirements need to apply, especially if we're taking data from like a commercial mobile network operator like AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon into a federal system that may have its own security perimeter and regulatory and policy needs to get into, but also looking at some of the data protection requirements based off of specific use cases as well. So in parallel with this data initiative effort that we have going on, looking at the technical requirements for data sharing for sensing out of mobile networks, the Next G Alliance Policy Committee will be looking at the legal, regulatory, and policy impacts of integrated sensing communications and its related data products to understand where there may be certain requirements that agencies adhere to, where potential liability issues may arise, who's responsible for what sort of data, how it may impact service level agreements with potential customers, as well as ensuring that the right data is protected at the right times and we're meeting all the needs of our customer base. Because this will be in the policy committee, this particular work stream will be limited to NGA full members, as it is stipulated by the NGA operating procedures. So for those within NGA, nothing new there. But just want to make folks aware in case folks are looking at joining NGA with an interest in participating with this particular policy component. So as far as next steps go, this initiative will be meeting bi-weekly on Mondays from 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern, starting on June 29th, so about 2 weeks. We do have linked in the slides, which will be posted to we will have a page up on the NGA website with these slides, the recording of this meeting, as well as this participant interest form. There's also a QR code here linking you to the participant interest form that you can access right now. And then we will also open the floor for questions. Please use the Q&A function within Teams to ask any questions and to get things kicked off. My first question, which I'll open up for the group, is we've, throughout the development of this process, we received a lot of questions on whether this will be just focused on government use cases, or they'll also be looking at commercial applications of sensing capabilities of mobile networks as well. I know we've kind of hinted at commercial aspects here, but for Brian, Doug, or Havish, are there any commercial aspects we'd be looking at in the future for this initiative, or commercial use cases, I should say? Brian, Doug, Havish? If you're speaking, you are on mute.
Well, let me go ahead and start. Yeah, certainly. The commercial use cases versus some of these government use cases, are all in play. We've identified, this initial set just because we know there are a lot of interest from some of the government consumers of ISAC that have a special interest in this. But certainly, as we better understand what some of the commercial use cases are and who the potential consumers of those commercial use cases are, certainly I think we could take those into account as well.
Maybe I could just add to that. I think a lot of this can be driven by making sure we find the consumers that are ready to talk to us. right? And I think that's got to be a key so that we can distill, useful information for the objective that we have on this. But I think we should certainly, review the list of use cases and identify where there are consumers that are ready to talk to us.
Yeah, and maybe I would just add that I think the certainly commercial use cases are also can be discussed here, and also it's important to understand as we consolidate all these requirements, at least some part of the requirements for sure will overlap with a large number of commercial use cases, and for those it is important to take them to the right standards bodies or to kind of make sure that this is implemented in the right way so that we do have the advantages of scale, but at the same time are able to serve the needs of consumers, especially here in North America and in the US. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all very much. We did get one question from Naveen on slide 13. On the work plan, we discuss identifying a standardization path on questions about NGA's mission and how we currently don't tackle any currently 3GPP topics, but this is, ISAC architecture and different use cases are a discussion in SA2 currently. And can we clarify how and when we plan to impact the standardization path? So I will start with, for those who don't know, NGA, we try to stay arm's length away from some of the existing standards activities, particularly so we don't duplicate conversations that may be ongoing in 3GPP or other forum, or have NGA solely be just a pre-meeting preparation venue. That said, we've been discussing with the proposers for this initiative and amongst some of our members, the challenge that we're seeing and talk to some of the government stakeholders is that they have requirements that they would like to see, integrated sense communications help solve, but some of their requirements are sensitive and they do not want to bring those up in a global forum such as 3GPP. So that's part of the rationale behind some of the work we're kicking off here and leading towards the path to standardization amongst the consolidated requirements, but it's also to take a 30,000-foot view as well. So at some point, looking at what 3GPP has ongoing, we're not trying to, steer 3GPP in a completely different direction or overlap with their work, but understand where the boundary, let's say, using that weather service example, where does the boundary between 3GPP scope and the mobile network stop? And then the boundary for a national weather service, weather forecasting system start, and what sits in between those two perimeters. So that's part of the standardization strategy. It may also mean engaging with domain-specific standards organizations that may be specific to whichever use case or potential stakeholder or customer to be interested in using sensing information rather than necessarily mobile network standards. Brian, Doug, Havish, have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I did put something into chat as well, but I think you covered the basics of it. But the other aspect I see is 3GPP is defining a generic architecture, really not addressing potentially what the consumer systems that are already out in place may need. And that's where I think this is filling the gap, is trying to understand, for example, a weather service, what systems they have in place and what data and in what format they would need to ingest ISAC data in order to augment those systems that they already have in place. And I think that's a bit of a gap from what 3GPP is doing or not addressing. And I think what we could do is help inform 3GPP as we learn about some of the needs from some of these existing consumers.
Yeah, and maybe I could also add that just to what Brian said, I mean, in some cases, we may not necessarily want these to go into 3GPP. I mean, so because that's going to be a pretty broad-based foundation, right? So I think, and that is where there's a spectrum, and identifying, where we draw that line is a big part of this effort, as I see.
Great, thank you. One question received is, will there be regular steering group updates provided for members who cannot attend regularly? Short answer, yes. So it'll follow similar kind of working parameters to some of the NGA working groups, even though this is separate from the working group structure, in that it will still report up to the steering group, provide regular updates in that venue, as well as for those who may not be able to attend but are in ATIS workspace as a participant, you'll still have access to contributions, meeting notes, agendas, that sort of output. And then we have a question about, and this one's kind of a loaded one. Do we envision changes to FCC customer protection network information and the protections that regulatory regime provides with ISAC? From my point of view, I think it's too early to tell, particularly since, one of the challenges that we have discussed that will be, or we have identified that will be discussed in the policy committee is some of the, given it's unclear entirely in the production network what sort of fidelity, particular mid-band spectrum we will have in detection on, and whether that's, we can detect that a person is there, and whether that, and if that person, if we can get any more definition beyond that. And then, but another challenge with that is networks will likely be able to detect more than just their customers. So there is no kind of contractual arrangement like we have currently today with cell phone subscribers between the subscriber and their mobile network. With ISAC, since it's kind of detecting the space around them, that does create new questions on what sort of legal or regulatory regimes may be to protect that data, if any at all. We have another question for initial ISAC deployments. Are we expecting a heavier reliance on monostatic sensing networks? Brian or Harish, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, maybe I could say something. I think that is, in a sense, that is maybe strictly not the focus of this group. But I mean, if I was to just speculate, it's not clear. I think that still needs to be borne out, what will be the main mode initially. But again, I think in this group, what we are focused on is the data products and how they will be transferred to the consumers. So to some extent, there may be less of a dependence on exactly what sensing mode is used.
Yeah, and I did just expand on that. That's exactly right. We're not focusing on the sensing end itself. We're focusing on the data products from sensing and how that's delivered to a sensing consumer, not the sensing portion itself, because that's already being handled elsewhere.
Great. One thing I would add is there may be, depending on the architecture of the sensing network, I think it kind of remains to be seen if it's going to be monostatic or bistatic initially. I think there is a view that monostatic base station sensing is probably especially if it can be done using existing infrastructure, is the easiest path forward. But part of this is we understand the data requirements and what fidelity or validity maybe or fidelity and confidence in the sensing result. There could be, we may want to assess different sensing architectures, whether it be monostatic, bistatic at the base station to UE bistatic, multistatic. I think there's a lot we could potentially unpack there, but I think a lot of it's going to be reliant on the specific use case and what the demands are for each use case to see whether some of the more, I would say, complex sensing architectures are warranted. And then another question on who defines the trusted third party and what are the obligations for minimal ingestible data sets? I think in part that's going to be dependent on the whoever owns the network doing the sensing. So like in a mobile network operator, it's going to be dependent on the policies and practices of each one, but that also may be use case dependent, depending on particular how they who the particular customer is, what fidelity of information there may be. But right now, I don't. My understanding, there is no, I would say, prevailing viewpoint on defining who is the trusted third-party customer at this point.
Yeah, agree, JD. I mean, this is one of the things that will be discussed, right? And I think in general, when we say third party, we mean, like you said, going beyond the mobile operator, whoever the mobile operator is shipping data to.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. I think these are great questions, but some of them we can't fully answer at this point, and are really purpose or the purpose of the group to get to the bottom of some of these questions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Doug. Where we don't have answers, that's what we have the initiative for, is to help drive some of these answers. I don't want to lose track of the second part of the question of the obligations for minimal ingestible data sets. I think that in part is going to be dependent on each use case and across, is depending if we're looking at the use case specific level, would depend on what's required for each customer, or if we're looking at across what's the kind of minimal common data set to satisfy, most customer needs. I think that still remains to be determined, but that's part of the reason why we're kicking off this initiative. So we have another question on how the effort will handle integration with government systems and what data will be required from the federal agencies. I'll kind of maybe start with the second part of the question first, then go to the first part. Is I think the key step is what data required from the federal agencies is kind of the question, is the what sort of data and schema are you expecting to ingest into whatever the subject system is. So for example, if you want to have more localized drone detection information being ingested into the National Air Traffic Control System, we would need to know from the FAA or the Department of Transportation, what sort of data and what formats, and what do the ingestion points look like to bring external data that may not already exist in the systems the FAA currently operates. So that would be the idea, is like what's the use case, what's the sort of information you need. If it's a new bespoke use case where it's hey, we're developing this new capability, there is no existing system, where the existing systems are too dissimilar to really use them as a baseline, then it'll be more like, okay, what are your operational requirements, what are your minimum technical specifications and kind of your moonshot goals for this system, so we can understand, how that aligns with the capabilities of what we're seeing from our tests today with ISAC detection, and then can we get the information from point A to point B. So that sort of requirements as well, in addition to like the latency and whether this is an always on or an as needed data request. And then this integration, a lot of it will depend on individual relationships between network operators supplying the data and the agencies that'll be consuming it. But some of that at a high level will be discussed if there is, overarching, I mentioned FISMA, or if there's, I think also, it's not necessarily a regulatory environment, but like the DISA STIGs that will need to be complied with in order to have that sort of interconnection between the mobile network, commercial mobile network supplying data into a government system. Well, at a high level, I want to make sure we're able to check all the boxes there to ensure security requirements are met, but a lot of that is going to be that integration will be done on a kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on the agency and the operator supplying the data.
So if I could just expand on that, JD, I think you hit the key points. What's required from the federal system, federal agencies is, well, what systems do you want the ISAC data integrated into? I think that's number one question. And then from that, well, what data do you need from ISAC and in what formats, and just all the different characteristics of that data, and what security measures do we need to place around it? Another good example would be, going back to that Doppler radar case in Arizona. If we were using ISAC to do low-level environmental detection, for example, of rotating clouds and things like that, the National Weather Service has products already that they make available, to the public, and they have feeds into their systems from their own NEXRAD radar systems. How would ISAC fit into that, into their existing product and integrate into it? I think it's questions like that we need to get a better understanding about. And that's one example. JD mentioned the FAA example. If there's counter UAS systems, how do they integrate? What counter UAS systems are being used, and is there a format of the data coming out of an ISAC system that would be used by those systems? I think all of these are the questions that's really driving this work, and I think integrating into those systems, what's going to be required is an understanding of what those systems are that we need to provide that integration with.
Great. Thank you, Brian. We have another question on whether granularity of the sensing data is it of interest to this group. For example, raw IQ data versus detection of target / position of target. Yes. I think that's part of like why we're trying to have this kind of a use case driven and kind of building that dialogue. And we do kind of expect it to be iterative between the stakeholder groups interested in using this sensing information and this data initiative as we kind of discuss and bridge these requirements with what the customers need versus what the network can provide, and kind of really looking at that architecture piece. Because I think this question gets a real good point. In a very extreme example, if a customer said, we want raw IQ data from the network and we want it sent to one single data center in Des Moines, Iowa in real time, that's going to eat up every single bit of fiber along the way, just in the sheer amount of data needing to be sent. So, some of that's going to go into if they really do need, to ingest into a customer system raw IQ data. It's like, okay, where is that touch point at? Is it at the base station? Is it in the local area? Is it a regional data center? That sort of thing, because that is a significant amount of data to generate and to consume. I think there'll be some discussion on like what pre-processing the network does do, like for example, that detection of the target or position of target maybe, and what tracks may exist, whether depending on how much additional data is required, whether that's done by the network, whether that's done by some third-party data aggregation system, or where that it is done along the way. Doug, Brian, Havish, anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered that well, JD.
And then we have another question
nothing to
on.
add.
Oh, great. Thank you. Will the initiative consider guest AI agents running in the MNO networks, ingesting ISAC data and the associated architecture and policy framework? My initial thought is yes. I think the question is, and this does get kind of tricky because now we're bridging the gap between, ISAC data and how AI will run within mobile networks. I think it'll be kind of dependent on the exact use case. If it's use case dependent, so for example, if it's something an AI agent the customer wants at the edge of a network to do data pre-processing separate from what maybe within kind of the 3GPP boundary, for example, But I think that's, something we'll definitely want to look at is what role AI will play kind of in as we move the data from the network to the customer.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't rule this out. I think it's part of the overall architecture discussion and how the data is going to get exposed and, potentially where AI agents sit. I think it's all for consideration. I think we need to not rule it out at this point.
So a question on security is that, does that mean we need to establish a trusted network before we start collecting data? I think that depends on what your definition of trusted network looks like. I think part of it is depending on and this actually dovetails into a second question that we just got. I think that depends on how, kind of how do we determine the sensitivity of what is sensed by the network? I think that kind of remains kind of an open discussion. And then, or if there is some post-processing that does provide, some more sensitive context, I think that also kind of remains to be seen. I think there's certainly a desire based off of, what we laid out in the initial work plan, as well as in the charter with the goals regarding security, is not necessarily purely confidentiality issues, although that can be important if it's, a sensitive issue. But also, I think kind of data integrity, especially ensuring that the data being relayed from, a mobile network doing sensing to a potential customer is accurate, and corrupt data is not being injected into that data stream. So I think this exact scope of that security looks like, I think, remains to be studied by this group and in conjunction with the policy group, because we did have a second question around how will this group address how the PII, or personally identifiable information, is dealt with. I think that in part, will be in part of our work with the policy committee, because I think it remains to be, it is still to be determined of, is raw sensing data, as I crudely put it, the mobile network detecting a water blob, is that considered PII, or does it need to be combined with other information? I think that still kind of remains to be seen, but that's kind of be part of the questions that the policy committee looks at is, where do some of these privacy obligations start? The minimum obligations versus kind of just the security best practices.
Yeah, and I'd say ZTA, right? That's the theme of 6G, right? And as far as the trusted network, I mean, certainly we need to build a trust relationship between the ISAC system, I'll call it the 3GPP system, and whoever we're giving that data to, right? It's not going to be just data that's provided to an untrusted third party. So I think that's when we say security, the authentication, authorization, policies on that data, I think it's assumed that there's, a trust relationship between the consumer of that data and the ISAC system itself.
Great. Thank you, Brian. We have another question, and I think it's a good one. So I'm going to make sure, Brian, you and Havish and Doug chime in on this one. Can you discuss outcomes? It is not clear if you are developing a reference architecture, data schema, API specifications, or a 3GPP release 21 contribution track.
Well, I'll start and say it's not the latter, not the last one there. I don't think that's the
so
focus
it's not
of
a
this.
3GPP release 21 contribution
Yeah,
track.
yeah.
Yeah, I would just gonna say
Yeah,
that I
and-
think we have to keep with with the structure that we have in NextG Alliance, that we're not doing the work of the standards. We're really providing the recommendations of what is needed. So I can see some of the maybe a higher layer architecture, but really we need to lay out some options and bring the the data together so that the standards can do their jobs.
Yeah, I'll add, I think a reference architecture is certainly in the cards. Data schema, I think it depends on some of the results of our discussion, but I would not necessarily say go as far as API specifications, because there are some existing, whether leave that up to whether it needs to be done in a domain specific standards organization, if it's going to be more telco specific, looking at some of the groups are looking at APIs in the telco space. Or if it is something bespoke, we may leave that up to like a new ATIS standardization track, if there isn't a good, clear home elsewhere. But really looking to hand off the very much in the weeds, 1 foot level data discussion to the right organizations set up to handle some of those standards and specifications.
Yeah, I would go into the data schema. We want to understand the data that's required by these trusted third-party systems or consumers, as we're calling them. What data do they need to do their mission? And that, I think, is really the crux of what we're trying to get at with this, and then understanding what architectures around that can support that.
Yeah, and I would add that, I mean, a lot of this actually depends on the outcome of the discussions in this group, right? I mean, especially the first phase that Doug was outlining, where we kind of try to understand the use cases and the requirements and things like that. So a lot of that will depend on the outcome. And, so nothing is really off the table. And then I think, at least from my perspective, when we talk about an architecture here, I think we are talking about like pretty high level, where does the data need to come from and where does it need to go? And then I think for a lot of detailed things, a key part of the outcome will be to understand, where should next steps be pursued. And maybe some of them will be in ATIS itself, but it depends on the discussions that happen in this group.
Great, thank you all. And just a quick reminder for folks, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box in the webinar, and we'll get that answered. We have one more question on, will there be cases where the MNO subscriber and ISAC data is jointly consumed? I think it's too early to tell. I would honestly lean towards potentially no, but there may be, there's a lot of questions around how will, again, for the policy committee to look at, how potentially, some of the lawful intercept laws in the U.S., that do give, with appropriate authorization, law enforcement agencies access to subscriber data, whether that will extend potentially to ISAC information or what that could look like. But I think I have not yet seen any use case in the discussions I've had where, it's been primarily focused just around the sensing data, not really about marrying up any subscriber data. All right, one quick last call for questions. We'll give another minute for folks to put questions in the chat. And then we will wrap up. So a question, the overlap with existing standards, and NATO standards are relevant. What needs to change in NATO ISR tracking standards 4676, for example? Brian, Havish, Doug, I don't know if you have any specific answer, but my response would be, we don't know yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer.
Yeah,
I have not seen the standards.
Yeah, that's I think a good question is going to have to be part of this dialogue with potential stakeholder groups. Is how much, it's going to be looking at what can and will change on the mobile network side as we look how we structure the data, its availability, and getting that from point A to point B, versus what may actually benefit from changes on, the domain specific standard side. What may be actually easier to change on the ingestion side to kind of improve the compatibility between the data source and the data recipient. I think, again, that's a lot of it kind of remains to be seen, as going to be part of the discussion, but that's certainly something we want to explore with the stakeholder groups is, we can change what we need to change on our side, or look at, is there need to be some tertiary systems in between the mobile network and the consuming system to restructure data as needed, or can we change how the consuming system receives data to be a little bit more compatible? All that kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I would just add, maybe agree with everything that was said, but maybe one thing to add here is that it is good for us to reuse as much as we can, existing specifications as they are applicable. But I think the important part here is to understand what is missing and what more is needed, right? So certainly we are not trying to reinvent or redo something that's already been done, but try to understand what augmentation is needed.
And we have one more question on, will there be a call for contributions for the weekly meetings? Short answer, yes. But if there's something specific you think you want to contribute or want to have addressed, feel free to reach out to myself and the chairs, and we can discuss how that works. I mean, will be a member and contribution driven initiative. So there may be different subjects that we bring in contributions for, but if there's something specific that you want to drive into the initiative, at one of the meetings, reach out to myself and the chairs, and we will do our best to accommodate. Another question, is there a view on latency, use of historic data as baseline, and how large will data sets be? A lot of that in the discussions we've had is going to be use case specific. I think we are going to use, for where historic data does exist, or if there are existing, other systems that are being used to ingest data, into, like, example, using air traffic control again is another example, like with ADS-B data and kind of the latency requirements and existing FAA radar information. We'll likely use that historical data to give us a baseline on, or at least the acquisition, latency requirements we used to generate that data. I think how large will the data sets be will be dependent on, I think, the requirements and what storage requirements they may be, what fidelity of information is required, the update frequency, for example. All righty. Are there any more questions from the audience? All righty. Well, thank you all very much for attending today. We really appreciate your interest in this effort. Thank you to our three co-chairs for their presentation and helping answer questions. Again, if you do have any, if you are interested in this work, please check out our participant interest form. If there's any further questions, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the co-chairs. We're happy to answer as well as we can. And we will hopefully look to talk with you all more in the future. And we will be posting the recording of this meeting and the slides onto the webpage for the initiative as well. So thank you all very much, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.